She was caged like an animal during labor as crowds cheered, until he shattered locks and saved her baby. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. On the edge of a small, dusty frontier town, Clara Whitmore's fate was being sealed in front of a crowd of onlookers. They had gathered not to celebrate, but to gawk. Clara, with her pale face twisted in pain, was being dragged towards an old wooden cage that had been set up in the center of the square. The sounds of murmurs and whispers filled the air as townspeople made their way to the makeshift arena. It was the day Clara had been dreading for weeks. The day she would be forced into marriage with Jake Blackjack Morrison, the outlaw leader feared throughout the Dakota Territory. She could already hear the raucous laughter of his men, standing nearby, eager for the spectacle to unfold. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to free herself from the men holding her, but it was no use. They were too strong. As they pushed her toward the cage, she felt the weight of the chains on her wrists, heavy with shame. The very idea of becoming Mrs. Morrison made her stomach twist with disgust. Jake Morrison was a ruthless outlaw who had terrorized the land for years, leaving nothing but destruction in his wake. His reputation was as dark as the gunbelt he wore, and now, she was his prize. The crowd cheered, not out of joy, but out of cruel entertainment. The men in the crowd laughed, some even calling out to Clara, making cruel remarks. She was nothing but a pawn in their twisted game. Make her scream, one man yelled, while others howled in amusement. She felt like an animal in a cage, trapped and exposed for all to see. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the reality of her situation settled in. She had no strength left to resist. As she was shoved into the cage, she collapsed to her knees, tears of helplessness filling her eyes. Her labor pains had begun earlier that day, and now, as the hours passed in her confinement, the pain intensified. Clara was alone in her suffering, her cries unheard amidst the jeers of the crowd. She clenched her teeth, trying to hold back the anguish. It felt as if her entire world was closing in on her, and she was powerless to escape. But then, just as she thought she couldn't endure any more, something changed. The crowd fell silent, as if a heavy presence had descended upon them. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, commanding, and calm. The man wore no badge, no obvious sign of authority, yet there was something about him that demanded attention. His piercing eyes locked onto Clara, and for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of hope. Without a word, he moved swiftly toward the cage, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The townspeople, who had been so eager to see her broken, now watched with bated breath as he approached. The man, with a quiet intensity, reached the cage and, without hesitation, shattered the locks. The heavy iron doors creaked open, and Clara was freed from her prison. She looked up in disbelief, barely able to comprehend what was happening. The man knelt beside her, his gaze soft but firm. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice low and steady. Clara's heart raced as she gazed at him. She knew who he was. This was not just any stranger. This was a man of honor, a warrior who had long been whispered about in the town, an outcast, feared and revered by all. And in this moment, he had come for her. The man's voice was calm, but his words cut through Clara's fear like a blade. "You're not alone anymore." The moment the cage door swung open, she was overwhelmed by a flood of emotions: relief, fear, confusion. Her labor pains still tore at her body, but they no longer felt like the only thing in the world. He was here. This stranger, whose presence had silenced the crowd, was now her lifeline. As she struggled to stand, he reached out and gently helped her to her feet. "Don't try to stand too quickly," he warned, his grip firm yet kind. Clara didn't know what to think. He was a tall man, dressed in worn leather and a faded shirt, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. His face was rugged but noble, and the way he looked at her made her feel seen for the first time in what felt like forever. Her mind raced, still trying to catch up with what was happening. Why had he come for her? And what would happen now? The man motioned for her to follow him. There was no time for explanations, no room for hesitation. He led her through the crowd of stunned onlookers, his presence parting the sea of spectators like a rock in a river. She stumbled slightly, weak from the ordeal, but he was there to steady her, his strength a silent promise. They moved quickly, and soon they were far from the mocking eyes of the townspeople. Clara's legs felt like jelly beneath her, but the man's hand never wavered. He guided her to a small camp on the outskirts of the town, nestled in the shadows of a cluster of trees. A simple fire burned in the center of the camp, its warm glow offering a comforting contrast to the cold, unforgiving world she had just left behind. "Sit," he instructed gently, gesturing to a large, weathered blanket spread out near the fire. Clara did as she was told, collapsing onto the blanket, her body shaking from both the physical strain and the shock of her unexpected rescue. As she settled, the man moved around the camp with practiced ease, gathering supplies. He wasn't speaking much, but his movements were deliberate, as if he was used to handling situations like this. She could hear the crackle of the fire and the rustle of fabric as he prepared something for her. "Water," he said, offering her a small canteen. She took it gratefully, drinking deeply as the cool liquid soothed her parched throat. Clara looked up at him, her mind finally catching up with the events of the past few hours. She had been a prisoner in that cage, surrounded by cruel spectators, until this man, this stranger, had appeared and freed her. But who was he? Why had he saved her? Her mind was too clouded to ask the questions she longed to know the answers to. She glanced down at the small bundle of blankets at her side, the baby that was soon to be born. The pain in her belly was still intense, but it felt more like a distant memory now that the immediate threat of her captivity was over. The man knelt down beside her, his presence quiet but reassuring. "I can help you," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to rest. Let me take care of things." Clara nodded weakly, her body too exhausted to protest. She had no choice but to trust him. There was no one else. As the night deepened around them, Clara could feel the warmth of the fire seeping into her bones, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to close her eyes and relax. She knew the danger wasn't over, but for now, she was safe. For now, the world was still. She had been saved, and somehow, in this strange, unsettling moment, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The man stayed beside her, his silent watch never wavering. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, Clara couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would he stay with her? And if so, what would that mean for her future? In the darkness, as the fire flickered and the wind whispered through the trees, Clara began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The warmth of the fire flickered across Clara's face as she lay on the blanket, trying to focus on the man beside her. He hadn't said much since the fire had started, but his presence was like an anchor in the storm of confusion and pain that still engulfed her. The man, whose name she didn't yet know, had saved her from certain death. He had broken the cage that had confined her, lifted her from the cruel hands of the townspeople, and brought her to this quiet refuge on the outskirts of town. Now, she lay here, just one step away from giving birth, but no longer alone. She could still hear the distant echoes of the crowds jeering, their cruel laughter still reverberating in her mind. But for now, they seemed like a distant memory. The man's calm eyes never left her face as he tended to the fire. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he was used to moments like these. Clara's chest tightened as she tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness rushing over her. Her labor pains were getting worse, and she could feel the sweat dripping from her forehead. "Don't try to move too much," the man said softly, sensing her struggle. "Rest. You're safe here." He spoke with such certainty that Clara found herself sinking back into the warmth of the blanket, her body unwilling to fight any longer. His voice was a strange comfort in a world that had been filled with nothing but fear. She watched as he turned away, his eyes scanning the surroundings, ever watchful. Clara felt a strange pull in her chest, a mix of gratitude and curiosity. Who was this man? What did he want with her? He hadn't asked for anything in return, hadn't spoken of any debts she owed. He had simply appeared and acted, saving her without a second thought. He was a mystery, and Clara found herself wanting to know more. As if reading her mind, the man finally spoke again, his voice low but steady. I won't ask you to trust me right away, he said. I know what you've been through. But I swear, I won't let anything happen to you. Not while I'm here. Clara's breath caught in her throat. His words, though simple, were filled with a depth of sincerity that she hadn't experienced in a long time. The harsh reality of the world had made her skeptical, made her assume that everyone had an ulterior motive. But this man, his eyes, his tone, suggested he was different. Clara's gaze softened as she watched him stoke the fire, the flames casting shadows across his face. She knew that if she were to survive this night, she would need to trust him, even if it meant letting go of the walls she had spent so many years building. The pain surged again, and Clara winced, clutching her stomach as the contractions intensified. She bit her lip, trying to keep the cries of pain from escaping. The man looked at her, his brow furrowing with concern. We need to get you through this, he said, his voice full of determination. You're not alone. I'm right here. He moved closer, kneeling beside her, and Clara, in her weakened state, found herself instinctively reaching out for his hand. She felt his warm, calloused fingers wrap around hers, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she felt a small spark of hope. I won't let go, he promised softly. Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes as the storm of labor raged through her. The man remained beside her, steady and strong, never once faltering as she struggled. His calmness was a balm to her frantic mind, and with each wave of pain, she found herself leaning into him more. As the hours passed, Clara began to realize something she hadn't considered before. She was safe. The world outside, with its cruelty and injustice, no longer had a hold on her. In this moment, it was just the man, the fire, and the soft sound of the wind rustling through the trees. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a woman destined to become the property of a man she feared. She was free, and for the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it. With his help, she would bring this child into the world. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. As the night deepened, Clara's breathing became more controlled, though the pain was still present, sharp and relentless. The fire crackled softly beside her, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the trees that surrounded their small camp. The man remained at her side, his hand never leaving hers, his quiet presence grounding her in the midst of the storm that raged within her. She was exhausted, mentally, physically, and emotionally, but the strength of his touch was the only thing that kept her tethered to the world around her. Hours had passed since the pain had begun to ebb, and in that time, Clara had come to rely on the man more than she could have ever imagined. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He had simply been there, steady and strong, helping her through the most harrowing experience of her life. The baby was coming, but with each breath, Clara felt a strange sense of calm that she had not expected. The man's face was unwavering, his eyes fixed on her with quiet determination. She knew he was ready, just as she was, but there was something more to his presence than simply being a protector. It was as if he had lived 100 lives and carried with him the weight of each one. But now, in this moment, he was only here for her. Clara's thoughts raced. Why had he come for her? What had driven him to save a woman he didn't know? There had been no hesitation, no second thoughts. He had acted when others might have turned away. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, but also a gnawing sense of curiosity that she couldn't shake. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man didn't immediately respond. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and steady. "I am called Cade." Clara's eyes searched his face for any hint of something more, but there was nothing. His expression remained impassive, as though he had revealed everything there was to know in that one word. "Cade." She repeated it softly in her mind, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand the man who had become her savior in a matter of hours. He didn't seem like a typical hero. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing that screamed savior. But his presence was undeniable, and the weight of his silence spoke louder than any words could. As Clara focused on the task at hand, she felt another contraction surge through her, sharper than the last. She gasped, clutching Cade's hand tightly, her grip stronger than before. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice soft but unwavering. "You're doing well. Just a little longer." Clara nodded, taking comfort in his words, even though they seemed impossible. How could she keep going? How could she survive this ordeal when everything inside her screamed for relief? But Cade's steady gaze never wavered. He was right beside her, giving her the strength she needed to push through the pain. As the night stretched on, Clara's world narrowed until there was only Cade, the fire, and the baby she was about to bring into the world. Each wave of pain felt like it would tear her apart, but Cade was there, reminding her that she was not alone. The sound of her ragged breathing filled the silence between them as the minutes seemed to stretch into eternity. And then, as the pain surged once more, something changed. The world around her seemed to blur, and for a moment, she felt as though she were floating, carried by the strength of Cade's presence. She pushed, harder this time, feeling the weight of the moment in her bones. With one final, intense contraction, the pain peaked, and then, suddenly, there was nothing. A soft cry broke the stillness, a sound so pure and new that it made Clara's heart leap. She collapsed back onto the blanket, her chest heaving with exhaustion, her body trembling from the effort. The baby was here. It was done. Cade moved quickly, his hands gentle yet efficient as he worked to wrap the baby in a cloth. Clara watched him, her eyes heavy with fatigue, but her heart filled with a new sense of wonder. Cade placed the baby gently into her arms, and Clara couldn't help but smile, tears welling in her eyes. "It's a boy," Cade said quietly, his voice filled with something she couldn't place. Pride, perhaps. Clara nodded, looking down at her son, the tiny miracle she had brought into the world. She had feared for so long that she would be alone, but now, in this moment, she was surrounded by strength and hope. Cade's gaze softened as he watched her, his eyes betraying a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken. And in that moment, Clara realized that she didn't have to know his past, didn't have to understand why he had saved her. All that mattered was that he had. He had given her the chance to be a mother, to survive, and for that, she would be forever grateful. As the fire crackled in the distance, Clara held her son close, feeling a bond that went beyond words, a bond that could never be broken. With Cade by her side, she knew that she would survive this wilderness. She would survive, and she would thrive. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, Clara felt ready to face it. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting a soft golden glow over the camp. Clara had not slept much, her mind still racing, her heart still heavy from the night before. But the baby was sleeping peacefully in her arms, and for that, she was grateful. It felt surreal. Just hours ago, she had been trapped in a cage, surrounded by jeers and ridicule, but now she was here, with Cade, safe, and with her son. A sense of calm began to settle over her as she held her baby. Close, his tiny fingers wrapped around her hand. The warmth of his little body against hers was the only comfort she needed in that moment. Cade moved around the camp quietly, gathering supplies for the day. He hadn't said much after the birth, but his presence had been steady, unyielding. Clara watched him from where she sat, still trying to make sense of everything. Who was he? Why had he helped her? These questions echoed in her mind, but she found herself afraid to ask. There was something about him that told her he wasn't ready to share his past. Perhaps he wasn't ready to share his reasons for saving her, either. As the fire crackled, Clara shifted her focus back to her son, studying his face, his peaceful expression. She could hardly believe that just hours ago, she had been in so much pain. The labor had been agonizing, but it was a pain that led to something beautiful. Her baby, her son. She felt a surge of pride fill her chest. He was everything she had fought for. A new life, a new beginning. Cade returned to the fire with a small bundle of herbs and a bit of water. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at her, the softening of his expression, spoke volumes. She smiled at him, feeling the connection between them grow, even if it was unspoken. It wasn't just the birth of her son that had brought them together. It was the way he had appeared in her darkest hour, with no hesitation, no second thoughts. He had given her a chance to live, to be a mother. The least she could do was trust him, even if she didn't know everything about him. "We'll need to move soon," Cade said, breaking the silence. "The town isn't far, but it's not a place you want to stay in for long. There are people there who won't look kindly on us." Clara nodded, her thoughts still clouded. The fear she had felt in the cage, the terror that had gripped her heart, returned in a small wave. The town. They had to leave it behind, but she didn't know where they could go. She had no family left, no place to call home. And yet, somehow, she felt safer now than she ever had before. "Where will we go?" she asked softly, her voice uncertain. "There's a cabin," Cade replied, looking down at the baby in her arms. "It's a place I've kept hidden. It's far from the town, hidden in the hills. We'll be safe there." Clara's heart beat a little faster at his words. Safety. The idea of a safe place seemed so foreign to her now, so distant. But with Cade, it felt possible. He had already given her so much, and now he was offering her more. A chance at a life free from the fear that had defined her existence for so long. The baby stirred in her arms, and Clara gently rocked him, the small movements a reminder of how fragile this new life was. She had to protect him. She had to keep him safe, no matter what. "We leave at first light," Cade said, gathering their things. "I'll pack up what we need. You rest." Clara wanted to protest. She wanted to help, but her body was still exhausted, her energy drained from the night's ordeal. She nodded instead, lying back on the blanket, watching Cade as he moved around the camp. There was a quiet strength to him, a confidence that reassured her. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to relax. But the moment she did, the weight of the situation hit her all over again. The town, the life she had been forced to live, her father's debts, the cruel men who had tried to take her. All of it seemed so far away now, but she knew that at any moment, it could come rushing back. Cade must have sensed her unease. He knelt beside her, his eyes soft. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low and soothing. "We're going to be all right." Clara looked at him, her gaze searching his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. He was unwavering in his promise. She believed him, and for the first time in a long while, Clara allowed herself to believe in something other than fear. She believed in him. She believed in the future they could have together, away from the town, away from the past. It was a small hope, but it was hers. The fire crackled again as the night settled deeper into silence. Clara closed her eyes, the warmth of her son in her arms and the promise of safety in her heart. Whatever happened next, she would face it. She would protect her son, and together with Cade, they would find their way. The morning broke with a soft chill in the air, the sky pale and endless above the hills as Clara sat by the fire, her son resting peacefully in her arms. The quiet of the forest surrounded them, a contrast to the chaos of the world they had just left behind. She could feel the weight of everything that had happened, the cage, the town, the cruelty she had endured. But now, in this moment of calm, she could also feel something else, hope. Cade had told her they were leaving at first light, and now, with the sun rising over the horizon, it was time to move. She glanced up at him, still busy packing up their belongings, his movements fluid and purposeful. He hadn't said much about the cabin he had mentioned the night before, but Clara trusted him. He had kept his word so far, and she had no reason to doubt him now. The night had passed slowly, and though she had tried to sleep, her mind had been too full of questions, too full of thoughts of the future. Where would they go? What would their life be like? And yet, despite the uncertainty, Clara found herself willing to trust him. Cade was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Clara didn't know where his loyalty lay or what had driven him to save her, but in that moment, she didn't need to know. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was a comfort. He wasn't trying to explain himself. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He had saved her, and for the first time, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. The fire sputtered, the embers casting a soft glow in the growing daylight. Clara carefully set her son down, wrapped in a bundle of furs to keep him warm. She stood slowly, feeling the ache in her body from the labor of the night before. Her legs were stiff, and the exhaustion from everything she had endured was starting to settle in. But there was no time for rest now. She had to keep moving. She glanced back at the small camp they had made and felt a pang of sadness. It was here that she had been born, anew, where she had found her strength. But it was time to leave it behind. Cade finished packing their things and turned to her, his eyes steady. "You ready?" he asked, his voice as calm as ever. Clara nodded. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she was ready. She had no other choice but to keep going forward. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and reached for her son. Cade moved beside her, his eyes scanning the path ahead. The air was still cool, but the sun was rising higher, and soon the warmth would spread across the land. As they made their way through the trees, the silence between them felt like a shield, protecting them from the world outside. The cabin Cade spoke of was still a mystery to Clara, but she trusted him. He had kept her safe so far, and she had no reason to believe he wouldn't continue to do so. The journey ahead was unknown, but for the first time in years, Clara felt like she was walking towards something better. She had been trapped in a cage before, but now, as they walked away from the remnants of her past, she felt free. Her thoughts drifted to the town they had left behind, to the faces that had mocked her, to the life she had been forced to endure. But it didn't matter anymore. She was moving forward, and that was all that mattered. The forest was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves beneath their feet and the distant calls of birds overhead. The world felt wide open, full of possibility, even if Clara didn't know what was to come. She glanced at Cade as he led the way, his face focused and calm. There was a part of her that still wondered who he really was, what had driven him to save her, but in this moment, it didn't matter. She was safe. She was free. And as they continued down the path, with her son nestled close to her chest and Cade by her side, Clara knew that no matter what lay ahead, she would face it with strength and courage. She had found a new beginning, a new life, and with that, she knew she could survive anything. The sun was high now, casting long shadows across the forest. As Cade and Clara continued their journey through the thick woods. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, but Clara felt the weight of each step. Her body still ached from the ordeal, and though she had rested during the night, her mind was far from at ease. She glanced down at her son, who was nestled in the blanket she held tightly in her arms, his small breath steady. The journey was slow, and every moment that passed seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them. She had hoped for a quiet escape, but the fear that gripped her heart still lingered. The town was far behind them now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Clara's thoughts drifted back to the night she had spent in the cage, the way the crowd had cheered as if her suffering was some kind of entertainment. It was a memory she wanted to forget, but it haunted her every time she closed her eyes. She had been so close to losing everything, to becoming nothing more than a pawn in their cruel game. But now, with Cade at her side, she felt as though she had a chance to rebuild, to reclaim her life. She looked at him now, his face set in its usual calm, though his eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings. He was always alert, always watching, and Clara knew it was because of him that they were still safe. She didn't know what had driven him to help her, but she trusted him more than she had ever trusted anyone before. His silence had become a comfort. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand anything from her. He simply acted, and that was enough for her. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a small clearing. The trees parted, revealing a modest cabin tucked into the hillside. It was small, worn, but it seemed like a sanctuary compared to the chaos they had left behind. Cade stopped for a moment, his gaze shifting between the cabin and the forest around them. "We're here," he said quietly. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The cabin was their safe haven, but even here, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The world outside felt so much bigger now, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face whatever it might bring. Cade walked ahead, leading her to the door. As he opened it, a faint creak of wood echoed in the quiet, but it didn't matter. They were alone. The door opened to a small, dimly lit room. There was a hearth in the corner, a small wooden table, and a few mismatched chairs. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Clara stepped inside, the weight of the journey pressing on her as she let out a deep breath. The fire would warm the room soon enough, but right now, the only thing she could focus on was the safety they had found here. Cade closed the door behind them and moved to the fireplace, his movements efficient. Clara sat down on one of the chairs, her body finally starting to relax now that they were away from the constant threat of the town. She felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, but her mind raced. "What now?" she asked quietly, her voice betraying the uncertainty she had been holding back. Cade looked up from the fire he was tending. "Now we rest," he replied. "We stay here for a while, get you both some peace. But we'll need to move on eventually." His words were calm, But there was something in his tone that told Clara he wasn't sure of what came next, either. It was as though the road ahead was just as uncertain for him as it was for her. Clara nodded, though the thought of leaving the safety of the cabin filled her with dread. "How long will we stay here?" she asked. "Long enough to heal," Cade answered. He didn't elaborate, but Clara understood. She needed time. She needed to feel safe, to recover from everything that had happened. She needed to be a mother to her son, to give him a future, and Cade's presence here gave her that chance. The fire crackled, and Clara's gaze lingered on the flames, the warmth slowly sinking into her bones. For the first time since her escape, she allowed herself to breathe. Cade came over to her, his face unreadable, but there was something comforting in the way he stood beside her. "You're safe here," he said, his voice soft. "You can rest. And when you're ready, we'll figure out what comes next." Clara nodded again, closing her eyes as the weight of the moment finally caught up with her. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't be facing it alone, and that, in itself, was enough. The days passed quietly in the small cabin nestled in the woods. The fire crackled steadily, keeping the chill of the night at bay, while Clara spent most of her time caring for her son, feeding him, and making sure he was comfortable in the small world they had created. Cade was always close, his presence a constant reassurance, though his silence remained as thick as ever. He would leave the cabin early each morning, disappearing into the forest for hours. Clara never asked where he went or what he did, trusting him to return with whatever they needed. She couldn't help but wonder, though, what lay beyond the quiet refuge they had found here. The world outside, the town, and everything she had left behind felt like a distant nightmare. The past was no longer something she feared. It had been replaced with the heavy weight of the unknown future. Days turned into weeks, and though the peace of the cabin was a welcome relief, Clara's restlessness grew. She had never been the type to sit idle for long. She had always been used to doing something, to contributing, but here, all she could do was wait. Wait for Cade to speak. Wait for her son to grow. Wait for whatever came next. There were moments when Clara's mind drifted back to the life she had once known. The house, the farm, the family she had lost. She thought of her father and his gambling debts, of the cruelty she had suffered at the hands of men who never saw her as a person. But now, in this cabin, she had a chance to rebuild. She didn't know how or when it would happen, but she could feel it. The sense that there was still hope, still a future worth fighting for. Cade had been a constant, a steady figure in her life since the night he had saved her. Despite his quiet nature, he had a way of calming her, of making her feel safe. He had never once asked for anything in return, and Clara wondered if he ever would. His actions spoke, louder than any words, and for that, she was thankful. She had always been independent, had always fought for her own survival, but now, she was beginning to realize that survival alone was not enough. She needed something more. She needed connection, a sense of belonging, and Cade, in his own silent way, had given her that. One morning, Cade returned from his usual early trip into the woods. He carried a bundle of dried herbs and some game he had caught. As usual, his face was impassive, but Clara could tell something had changed. There was a tension in his posture, a subtle shift that made her sit up straighter. He set the bundle down by the fire and looked at her, his gaze steady. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had known this moment would come eventually, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Cade sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been watching the town. There are people looking for us. We can't stay hidden forever." Clara's heart sank. She had hoped that they could simply fade away, disappear into the wilderness, and leave the past behind. But now, the reality of their situation was settling in. She looked down at her son, who was still asleep in her arms, and felt a rush of protectiveness. She had to do whatever it took to keep him safe. "So what do we do?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We move on," Cade said. "There's another place. A village up north. It's small, quiet. We can stay there for a while, get some work, start fresh. But we need to leave soon." Clara nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling heavily on her chest. She had thought they had found a place of peace, but now it was time to leave it behind. The cabin had been a sanctuary, a brief respite from everything they had escaped, but it wasn't enough to outrun the world they had come from. How long will it take to get there? Clara asked, trying to focus on the logistics, to push away the wave of uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm her. A few days, maybe more, Cade replied. It's not far, but we'll need to be careful. We can't risk being spotted. Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had been afraid for so long, but now, the fear had become a part of her. She couldn't let it control her any longer. All right, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. We'll go. We'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe. Cade nodded, a small flicker of approval in his eyes. We leave at first light. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Clara packed what little they had left, taking only what was necessary: clothes, food, the few precious items she couldn't leave behind. The fire burned low as the night fell, and she found herself lying awake, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about the future. It was uncertain, yes, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. Cade was by her side, and she had her son. That was enough. The air was cool and crisp as they left the cabin behind, stepping into the quiet of the forest once more. Clara felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety wash over her. The safety she had found in the cabin now seemed like a distant dream, and the reality of what lay ahead was beginning to settle in. She had hoped they could stay hidden, that the peace they had found in the solitude of the woods would last. But now, with Cade leading the way and the weight of their journey pressing on her, she knew they couldn't run forever. The world they had left behind was still out there, and it was catching up to them. As they walked, the forest around them felt alive with the sounds of nature, birds calling, the rustling of leaves beneath their feet. It was beautiful, but it was also a reminder that they were exposed. Clara kept a steady pace, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her son, wrapped tightly in her arms, was still asleep, his tiny body nestled against her. She looked down at him, feeling the soft rise and fall of his chest. He was safe for now, but for how long? Clara had always been a fighter, but this was different. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was fighting for him, for his future, and that made everything more complicated. Cade walked ahead, his movements purposeful, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. He hadn't spoken much since their decision to leave, but Clara could sense that he was just as aware of the danger they were in as she was. His silence had become a comfort, but now, it felt like a barrier. She wanted to ask him questions, wanted to know more about him, about where they were going, but she held back. Something in the way he carried himself told her that he wasn't ready to share yet. There was still so much she didn't know about him, about his past, but she trusted him. Trust. It was a word she had stopped believing in a long time ago, but somehow, with Cade, it felt different. As the hours passed, the landscape began to change. The dense forest started to give way to rolling hills, the trees thinning as they made their way toward the northern village Cade had spoken of. Clara could feel the tension in her muscles start to ease as they moved further from the town they had fled. It was hard to imagine that they were getting closer to something safer. The unknown loomed ahead, and with it, the uncertainty of what lay in store for them. Cade finally spoke, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. We're almost there, he said, his voice calm. Clara nodded, her mind racing with questions. How much farther? She asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. Not much, Cade replied. We'll be there by nightfall. The thought of reaching their destination brought a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. She knew they would have to keep moving, keep hiding, until they could find a place to settle. The village Cade had mentioned sounded like their best chance at a fresh start, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it might not be as safe as he believed. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the hills, Clara's thoughts turned inward. She glanced at Cade, who was still walking ahead, his expression unreadable. There was a certain strength to him, a quiet power that made her feel safe, but it also made her wonder what he was hiding. He had saved her, but what did he want in return? Did he have his own reasons for helping her? She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that they were still moving forward, still alive. As the village came into view in the distance, Clara's heart began to race. This was it. This was their chance. They had made it this far, and she couldn't afford to falter now. She looked down at her son, his small face peaceful in sleep, and made a silent promise to him. No matter what happened next, she would protect him. Cade slowed his pace as they approached the edge of the village, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. Clara followed his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. They had come so far, but they weren't out of danger yet. Cade turned to her, his voice low. "Stay close," he said. "Don't let anyone see you." Clara nodded, tightening her grip on her son. She had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. She would face it with Cade by her side, and with her son in her arms. They would make it. The village ahead was smaller than Clara had expected, nestled between the hills and wrapped in a blanket of early evening shadows. The buildings were modest, with low stone walls and thatched roofs, and the air was quieter than the town they had left behind. It was a place that seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world, but Clara knew better than to assume that peace would come easy. As they neared the village's edge, Cade slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the few figures that wandered in and out of the small homes. Clara could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't used to being this close to people, to strangers who might not understand their story. She tightened her grip on her son, the weight of him grounding her in the moment. Cade stopped near the edge of a tall building, one of the larger structures in the village. It looked like a simple community hall, and Clara could hear muffled voices from inside. Cade turned to her, his voice low. "Stay close," he said. "We can't afford to draw attention. Just follow my lead." Clara nodded, feeling a familiar unease creep up her spine. She had been on the run for so long that the thought of being around people again made her nervous. But she had no choice now. She trusted Cade, and she had to believe that whatever plan he had would be enough to keep them safe. They walked toward the hall, Cade leading the way with his usual quiet confidence. Clara followed closely behind, keeping her eyes on the ground as they passed the few villagers who were still out in the fading light. Most of them paid no attention to them, focused on their own lives. But Clara noticed the occasional glance, the curiosity that lingered in the air. They reached the door to the hall, and Cade pushed it open gently, the creak of the hinges barely audible. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a few scattered lanterns, the flickering light casting long shadows on the wooden walls. A small group of people sat around a large table, their voices hushed as they talked in low murmurs. Cade stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. Clara followed, staying close to him as she scanned the room. A man at the far end of the table looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed them. His face was weathered, with a long beard and eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. Cade gave him a small nod, and the man's expression softened. "You made it," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Thought you might have taken longer." Cade didn't reply immediately, instead giving a brief glance back at Clara. "We need a place to stay for a while," Cade said finally. "And something to trade. I've got goods from the north. We need shelter." The man nodded, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "We've got room, but it'll cost you." Clara felt her stomach tighten. She had hoped the village would offer them some kind of safety, but now, even here, there were conditions. Still, she had no choice. They needed shelter, and if that meant bartering, then that's what they would do. "What do you need?" Cade asked, his voice steady. The man looked between them, his gaze lingering on Clara for a moment before he turned back to Cade. "We need help with a few things around here. Supplies are low. We've got a few farms that need extra hands. If you can help with that, we'll give you a place to stay." Clara could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She wasn't used to relying on others, and the thought of working for her safety didn't sit well with her. But there was no other option. She nodded slowly. "We'll help," she said. "Anything you need." The man's expression softened, and he gave a slight grin. "Good. I'll have someone show you to a room. The rest can be settled tomorrow." Clara exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders start to ease. It wasn't the answer she had wanted, but it was an answer. They had a place to stay, and for now, that was enough. Cade turned to her and nodded, his eyes calm. "We'll be okay," he said, his voice low. Clara didn't reply, but she could feel the weight of his words settling into her bones. They would be okay. She had to believe it. As they followed the man to the back of the hall, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. The danger of the town, the fear of being caught, was behind them now. They were safe for the time being. But Clara knew that their journey was far from over. They had found a temporary refuge, but the road ahead was still uncertain. And yet, as she glanced at Cade, who was leading them with quiet determination, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. They had made it this far, and together, they would face whatever came next. The next few days in the village passed in a quiet, steady rhythm. Clara had settled into the small room provided to them, a simple, modest space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto the quiet village streets. The people here were kind but distant, and Clara could feel the weight of their curiosity, though none of them asked too many questions. They were a small community, bound by necessity, and they accepted the help Cade had offered in exchange for their shelter without much fanfare. Clara spent her days doing what she could to help. The village was in need of supplies, and there was always work to be done: hauling water from the stream, gathering firewood, and tending to the few crops that managed to survive the harsher seasons. Cade was a quiet, efficient worker, but Clara could see that he never fully relaxed. He would disappear early each morning, as usual, returning with more supplies or news from the surrounding area. He never spoke much of what he did or where he went, but Clara didn't press him. She was learning to trust his silence, knowing that when he was ready, he would share. She had learned, too, that her own silence was becoming more comfortable. There was something about this place, this quiet village, that allowed her to rest, to breathe a little easier. But despite the sense of safety they had found, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were only biding their time. The road they had taken to get here had been long and full of danger, and she knew that the same forces that had hunted them before could still find them. She had no idea how long Cade planned to stay here, or if they would be forced to leave again when the village no longer felt like a hiding place. One afternoon, as Clara was gathering water at the stream, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she kept tucked at her side. But when she saw Cade standing there, she relaxed. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but today, there was something different in his eyes. He was holding a bundle of herbs, his movements deliberate. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice low. Clara's stomach tightened. "What is it?" she asked, her heart beginning to race. Cade stepped closer, looking over his shoulder to ensure they were not being watched. "I've been to the northern border," he said, his tone even. "There's trouble. People have been asking questions." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had known this day would come, the day when their past would catch up with them. She had hoped it would be farther off, that they could have a few more months of peace. But it was here now. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Cade didn't answer immediately, his gaze distant. "I don't know yet," he said. "But it's too close. If we stay here, they'll find us. And when they do, there won't be time to run." Clara swallowed hard. The fear she had kept buried deep inside her was starting to bubble to the surface. She had known, on some level, that they couldn't hide forever, but hearing it from Cade made it real. The danger was no longer distant, it was right in front of them. She looked at her son, who was bundled safely in her arms, his small face peaceful in sleep. She would protect him. She had to. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Cade's eyes met hers, and for the first time since they had arrived in the village, there was a flicker of something that might have been doubt, or perhaps fear, behind his steady gaze. "We leave," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Tonight." Clara felt her heart race as the weight of his words sank in. They couldn't stay here. She had known it, but hearing it now, so plainly, brought everything into sharp focus. She looked down at her son once more, his tiny body a reminder of everything she had to lose. "How long will it take to get to safety?" she asked, her voice tight. "A few days, maybe less," Cade replied. "We'll head east, away from the main roads. There's a place I know, a cabin in the hills. It's isolated, but it's secure." Clara nodded, her mind already racing, planning for what was to come. There was no time to waste. No time for hesitation. They had to move, and they had to move fast. "All right," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear that clawed at her chest. "We'll leave tonight." Cade gave her a single nod, his eyes flicking toward the village. "Gather what you need," he said. "I'll pack what we can carry." Clara watched him walk away, the weight of their future pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't know what the next few days would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't running away anymore. She was fighting for their lives, and she would do whatever it took to keep them safe, no matter what came next. The night was darker than Clara had expected as she packed the few belongings they had managed to gather. The village around them was still, with only the sound of distant crickets breaking the silence. The danger that Cade had warned her about was real now, and with every passing minute, the weight of their situation pressed harder on her chest. Cade had already gone ahead to prepare the path, and Clara was left alone in their small room, trying to make quick decisions. Every item she packed felt like it could be the last thing she would carry from this place. She didn't know when she would return, or if she would return at all. She had always been a survivor, but this time, it wasn't just her life on the line. It was her son's. She glanced down at him as he slept soundly in his blanket. His tiny face, peaceful and unaware of the turmoil around him, was the only thing keeping her moving. Clara carefully gathered the few things that mattered most: her son's small clothes, a knife Cade had given her for protection, a few scraps of food, and some personal items she had brought with her when they first escaped the town. She could hear the rustling of leaves outside as Cade made his way back, his silhouette visible in the dim light. He stepped through the door, his face grim but steady, and she knew it was time to go. "We leave now," Cade said, his voice quiet but firm. Clara nodded and stood, wrapping her son securely in her arms. "Is everything ready?" she asked, trying to mask the fear in her voice. Cade gave a quick nod. "We move quickly, no distractions. We can't afford to be seen." They didn't waste any more time. The moon was high in the sky, casting a faint glow across the path as they made their way out of the village. The streets were eerily quiet, and Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency pulse through her. She followed Cade closely, every step measured, every sound analyzed. The village had been kind to them, but it was time to leave it behind. The thought of heading into the unknown was terrifying, but Clara had no choice. She had to trust Cade. They moved swiftly through the trees, the sounds of their footsteps barely audible over the crunching leaves underfoot. Clara felt her body tense with each sound, her senses heightened in the stillness of the forest. It felt like they were walking on the edge of something dangerous, and each step was another risk. The path grew steeper as they climbed, but Cade never faltered. His focus was unwavering, and Clara followed closely, doing her best to keep up despite her exhaustion. The night seemed to stretch endlessly before them, and Clara could feel her energy beginning to wane. Her muscles ached, and her mind raced with worry. Would they make it to safety? Would they find the cabin Cade had spoken of? Or would they be caught before they could escape? Every question felt like a weight she couldn't shake. Hours passed as they continued their journey through the woods. Clara didn't know how much longer they had to go, but she could feel her body slowing down. Cade, however, remained as steady as ever, never once showing signs of fatigue. He glanced back at her occasionally, his eyes offering silent reassurance. When they finally reached the top of a small hill, Cade stopped. He surveyed the area, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. Clara stopped beside him, her breathing heavy from the climb. "We're almost there," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the long journey. Clara nodded, though a knot tightened in her stomach. The fear of being discovered, of being found by those they were running from, gripped her once more. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead of whatever was hunting them. The forest around them grew denser as they continued on. The trees were thick, the underbrush tangled, but Clara kept her focus on the path ahead. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her. As they walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the village faded away, replaced by the quiet whispers of the night. The air was cooler now, and Clara pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the chill. Her son shifted slightly in her arms, his small breath warm against her chest. Despite the danger they were in, she could feel a sense of peace wash over her. Cade had brought them this far. He had kept them safe, and for the first time in a long while, Clara allowed herself to believe that they might make it through this. She had no idea what awaited them at the end of their journey, but with Cade by her side, she knew they had a chance. They had made it this far, and that was all that mattered. They had walked for hours, the forest now thinning as they approached a quiet clearing, the moonlight barely touching the earth. Clara's legs ached, the weight of the journey settling heavily in her body. Her son was still nestled against her, sleeping soundly despite the chaos of their lives. But Clara could feel the shift in the air, the tension easing as Cade finally slowed his pace, his head turning to glance at the landscape around them. He stopped near a large rock, the kind that had been weathered by time, standing solitary against the backdrop of the wilderness. Clara came to a halt beside him, looking at the stone and then back at the trees, her heart beating louder as she realized they were almost there. "Is this it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Cade nodded, his gaze scanning the area one more time. "This is it. The cabin is just ahead," he said. His voice held a sense of finality in it, like this moment had been long awaited. Clara's breath caught in her throat. They had come so far, faced so much, and now it felt like the world had finally shifted in their favor. The constant fear of being hunted, the constant weight of not knowing where they would go next, seemed to have lessened, even if only for a moment. Clara took a deep breath and looked down at her son, still nestled securely in her arms. The soft rise and fall of his chest filled her with a quiet sense of peace. She had fought so hard to keep him safe, and now they were closer than ever to finding a place where they could rest. Cade moved ahead, his steps steady as he led her toward the cabin. The trees opened up to reveal a small, modest structure, hidden in the shadows of the wilderness. It was simple but sturdy, the kind of place that offered both protection and comfort. There was a small porch, a flickering light from within, and a warm glow that seemed to invite them inside. Clara followed Cade up the steps, her heart racing with anticipation. As they reached the door, Cade paused, turning to her. "This is it," he said quietly, his gaze softening. "You're safe here. We can rest." Clara's eyes softened as she nodded, feeling the exhaustion from their long journey way down on her. She had been running for so long, constantly moving, always on the edge of fear. But now, as she stood on the threshold of the cabin, she knew this was the beginning of something new. She stepped inside, Cade following closely behind her. The warmth from the fire that crackled in the hearth greeted them, the glow of its flames dancing across the wooden walls of the cabin. The air smelled of wood and earth, familiar and grounding. Clara set her son down on a small cot by the fire, her fingers lingering on his soft skin as she watched him sleep. She let out a long, slow breath, the weight of the past few days finally beginning to lift. For the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself to feel safe. The cabin was small but enough. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild. Cade moved to the hearth, stoking the fire with a few more logs, the flames growing brighter and warmer. He glanced back at Clara, his face impassive, but there was something softer in his eyes now. "You did well," he said, his voice low. Clara gave a small smile, her heart still full of the relief she had yet to fully process. "We both did," she replied quietly, her gaze moving to her son. Cade nodded and sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable. Clara sat down on the cot beside her son, her hand resting gently on his chest as she let herself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. They were safe. They had made it. "What happens now?" Clara asked, her voice breaking the silence. Cade paused for a moment, his gaze never leaving the fire. "Now, we start over," he said simply. Clara's heart swelled with emotion. Start over. She had feared that the past would always haunt her, that she would never be able to escape the fear and the pain. But now, here, in this small cabin, with her son and Cade beside her, she realized that it was possible. They could make a life. They could find peace. The fire crackled softly, the warmth filling the room as the night deepened outside. Clara felt the weight of the world begin to lift, replaced by a quiet, steady hope. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them. Together, they would build a future. And with that thought, Clara closed her eyes, the steady sound of her son's breathing beside her the only thing that mattered.